What if one of the most important health decisions you make in your 40s or 50s doesn't affect you until your 70s or 80s? Most people don't spend much time thinking about brain health, at least not until something starts to go wrong. Maybe it's a parent, maybe it's a grandparent, maybe it's someone close to them who begins experiencing memory loss, cognitive decline, or dementia. And suddenly the conversation becomes very real. But here's what's interesting. The processes that influence brain health often begin decades before symptoms ever appear. Not years, decades. Which means many of the choices we make today may influence how we function 20 or 30 years from now. And that's exactly why I wanted to make this video. Because one of the most researched genes in the entire field of healthy aging and brain health is a gene called APOE. Now, before you switch off because you think this is going to be a complicated genetics lesson, stay with me. Because this isn't really a video about a gene. It's a video about longevity. It's a video about healthy aging. It's a video about preserving the ability to think clearly, make decisions, remain independent, and continue doing the things you love for as long as possible. The APOE gene simply gives us a window into that conversation. Today I'm going to explain what APOE actually does, why researchers pay so much attention to it, why many people misunderstand it, what the science really says, and most importantly, what you can actually do with this information. Because if there's one thing I want you to take away from this video, it's that genes are not your destiny, but they can provide valuable information, and information helps us make better decisions. I'm Sarah from Biohacking Naturopath. I help active Australians optimize performance, recovery, and longevity through personalized health assessment, blood work interpretations, functional testing, and genetic testing. And let's get into it. One of the things I find fascinating is how much effort people put into planning their financial future. Think about it. People spend decades building superannuation, investing, paying off mortgages, building businesses, planning retirement, and all of those things are important. But very few people spend the same amount of time thinking about how they're actually going to function during retirement. Because living longer and living well are not the same thing. And that's where I think the longevity conversation often gets misunderstood. Most people think longevity means lifespan, how long you live. I think a much more important concept is health span. Health span is the number of years you remain healthy, active, independent, and mentally sharp. Because if someone lives to 90 but spends the final 20 years struggling with mobility, cognitive decline, or chronic disease, that's a very different outcome to someone who remains active and engaged for most of their life. When I speak to clients about longevity, I'm rarely talking about living to 100. I'm talking about maintaining function, maintaining resilience, maintaining quality of life, maintaining the ability to do things that matter to you. Spend time with family, remain independent, and that's why brain health becomes such an important conversation. Because for many people, the fear isn't death, the fear is losing independence. The fear is losing memory, the fear is losing the ability to recognize loved ones. The fear is becoming dependent on other people, and whether we like it or not, the prevalence of cognitive decline and dementia is increasing as populations age, which means understanding the factors that may influence brain health has never been more relevant. Now, this is where APOE enters the conversation, because if healthy aging is the destination, APOE is one of the signposts along the road. Not the entire roadmap, not the final outcome, just one important piece of information. And in my opinion, that's the healthiest way to think about genetics. Not as prediction, not as fate, but as information that helps guide better decisions. In the next section, we're going to talk about what APOE actually does inside the body and why researchers have spent decades studying it. So let's talk about what APOE actually does. Because before we can understand why this gene matters, we need to understand its job. APOE stands for apolipoprotein E. Now, I know that's not exactly the most exciting name in the world, but it's the role is incredibly important. Think of APOE as part of your body's transport and recycling system. One of its primary jobs is helping more fats and cholesterol move around the body. And that's particularly important because cholesterol has developed a bit of a bad reputation over the years. Most people hear cholesterol and immediately think heart disease, blocked arteries, something bad. But cholesterol is actually essential for life. Every cell membrane in your body contains cholesterol. Hormones are made from cholesterol. Vitamin D is made from cholesterol. And perhaps most importantly for this conversation, your brain relies heavily on cholesterol. The brain contains an enormous amount of lipid-rich tissue. In fact, your brain is one of the most cholesterol-rich organs in the body. So when researchers study APOE, they're not just studying cholesterol. They're studying how the brain maintains itself, repairs itself, and supports healthy neurological function over time. One analogy I often use with clients is to think of APOE like a logistics company. Imagine a city, resources need to be transported, repairs need to happen. Waste needs to be removed, infrastructure needs maintenance. That's essentially what APOE helps coordinate. It's involved in moving resources where they're needed and supporting repair processes, which becomes increasingly important as we age. Because aging isn't simply a process of getting older, it's a process of accumulating wear and tear. The body is constantly repairing itself. The brain is constantly adapting. The question is, how efficiently does that happen over decades? And that's where APOE becomes relevant. Now here's where things get interesting. There isn't just one version of APOE, there are 3 common variants. You have APOE2, APOE3 and APOE4. You inherit one copy from your mother and one copy from your father, which means people can have combinations such as APOE2/2, APOE2/3, APOE3/3, APOE3/4, APOE4/4, and so on. The most common version in the population is APOE3. Think of that as the most typical variation. APOE2 is less common and APOE4 is also less common. Now here's where the internet tends to lose its mind, because APOE4 has received enormous attention, and understandably so. Research has associated APOE4 with an increased risk of late onset Alzheimer's disease and certain aspects of cardiovascular risk. As soon as people hear that, they panic. They immediately jump to, I have APOE4, am I going to get Alzheimer's? Should I even test? And this is exactly where I need to slow down, because one of the biggest problems in genetics is that people confuse risk with certainty. They're not the same thing, not even close. In my opinion, this is the most important section of the entire video, because if you take APOE testing out of context, it can create unnecessary fear. Let's imagine 2 scenarios. Person 1 discovers they carry APOE4, they panic, they spend hours researching, they convince themselves their future is already determined. They become anxious, every forgotten name, every misplaced set of keys, every moment of brain fog. I've seen people do this, and it's completely understandable, but it's not helpful. Then you have person number 2. They discover they carry the APOE4 gene, and they think, okay, interesting. What can I do with this information? That's completely different response. One response only creates fear, the other creates action. And that's how I believe genetics should be approached, as information, not destiny. Let's use a different example. Imagine I told you your family had a strong history of skin cancer. Would you assume you're guaranteed to develop skin cancer? Probably not. You'd likely become more aware. You might wear sunscreen, you get regular skin checks, reduce unnecessary sun exposure. You'd use the information to make better decisions. That's exactly how I think about APOE, not as a prediction, but as an opportunity to become more proactive, more intentional, more aware, because risk does not equal outcome. In fact, one of the most exciting areas of longevity research right now is understanding lifestyle factors and how they interact with genetic risk. And that's where the conversation becomes much more empowering, because the question shifts from what genes do I have to what can I do about them? And that's exactly what we're going to talk about next, because this is where things get really interesting. We're going to explore the lifestyle factors that appear to have the biggest influence on long-term brain health, cognitive resilience, and healthy aging. So let's get into the question everybody wants answered. If APOE isn't destiny, what actually matters and what can you do? Because if you've made it this far into this video, you're probably not interested in collecting genetic information for the sake of it. You want to know how to use it, and this is where I think the conversation becomes genuinely exciting. Because when researchers look at healthy aging, they consistently find something interesting. Many of the same factors that improve physical health also appear to support brain function, which means the goal isn't to find a magic supplement, one or a miracle longevity factor. It's to build a body and brain that are resilient. And if I had to prioritize one intervention above almost everything else, it would be exercise. Not because it's trendy, not because everybody says it, because the evidence is extraordinary. Exercise improves cardiovascular health, metabolic health, insulin sensitivity, inflammation, mood, sleep, and importantly, it appears to support brain function as well. In many ways, movement is one of the most powerful longevity interventions we currently have, and one of the reasons may involve something called BDNF. BDNF stands for brain-derived nootropic factor, and if you've never heard of it before, don't worry. Most people haven't, but it's one of the most fascinating molecules in neuroscience. Researchers often describe BDNF as fertilizer for the brain. Now that's not technically what it is, but it's a useful analogy. Think about a garden. Plants need the right environment to grow, the right nutrients, the right conditions, the right support. Your brain is similar. Neurons need support. Connections need maintenance, and new connections need opportunities to form. BDNF helps support many of these processes. It's involved in neuroplasticity, which is your brain's ability to adapt, learn, change, and build new connections. And that's important because one of the biggest myths around aging is that decline is inevitable. Now, of course, aging happens, but your brain remains remarkably adaptable throughout life. The challenge is creating an environment that supports that adaptability. This is where exercise becomes increasingly interesting, because physical activity appears to increase BDNF production. In simple terms, movement may help create a more favorable environment for brain health. And this is one of the reasons I encourage people to stop viewing exercise solely through the lens of body composition. Most people think, I exercise to lose weight, I exercise to gain muscle, I exercise to improve fitness, and they're all great reasons. But you may also be investing in your future brain health. Every workout becomes more than a workout, it becomes an investment in your future mobility, your future independence, your future cognitive resilience. And when viewed through that lens, exercise becomes one of the most powerful longevity tools. If exercise is one pillar of healthy aging, then sleep is another. And this is an area where I think many high performers unintentionally undermine themselves, because our culture tends to celebrate sacrifice. The hustle, the grind, the late nights, the early mornings. People wear poor sleep almost like a badge of honor, but the science doesn't support the mindset. Sleep is not passive. Sleep is active recovery. In fact, some of the most important maintenance work happens in the brain, occurs while you're asleep. One of the most fascinating discoveries in neuroscience over the last decade is something called the glymphatic system. You can think of this as a waste clearance for the brain. Throughout the day, normal metabolic activity generates byproducts. Waste accumulates, maintenance is required. And during sleep, the brain becomes far more effective at clearing some of this waste. Now, we're still learning exactly how all of this fits together, but what we do know is that poor sleep appears to negatively impact many aspects of brain health, including memory, learning, mood, recovery, cognitive performance, and potentially long-term neurological health as well. This is one reason I spend so much time talking to clients about sleep. Not because it's exciting, not because it's glamorous, but because it works. You cannot out-supplement poor sleep. You cannot out-biohack poor sleep. You cannot out-train poor sleep. Sleep remains one of the foundational pillars of longevity. And if someone tells me they're interested in healthy aging while consistently sleeping 5 hours a night, that's usually where we start the conversation. Because before we talk about advanced testing, before we talk about supplements, before we talk about genetics, we need to make sure the foundations are in place. The next piece of the puzzle is nutrition. And again, this isn't about finding a miracle food. It's about consistently creating an environment that supports health. When researchers look at dietary patterns associated with healthy aging, a few themes appear repeatedly. Adequate protein, healthy fats, nutrient density, plant diversity, stable blood sugar regulation, and sufficient omega-3 intake. Omega-3 fatty acids have received enormous attention in the brain health space, and for good reason. The brain contains a significant amount of fat. Cell membranes rely on healthy fatty acid composition, and omega-3s appear to play an important role in neurological function and overall health. Now, I want to be careful here. I'm not saying omega-3s are a cure. I'm not saying everyone needs the same amount, but I do think they're one piece of a much larger picture. The bigger lesson is this: your brain is built from the inputs you provide it, day after day, year after year, decade after decade, which means every meal is either supporting resilience or contributing to dysfunction. Not perfectly, not overnight, but cumulatively. And longevity is ultimately a cumulative game. The choices that matter most are rarely the dramatic ones. They're the decisions repeated consistently over many years. In this next section, we're going to discuss one of the biggest drivers of modern chronic disease and why it may be one of the most important longevity conversations happening today: metabolic health. If you've followed the longevity space for any length of time, you've probably noticed something interesting. Researchers may disagree on the details, they may debate supplements, they may debate specific diets, but there is increasing agreement around one major theme: metabolic health matters, and it matters a lot. And in my opinion, it doesn't get nearly enough attention. Because when most people think about blood sugar, they think about diabetes. But metabolic health is much bigger than that. We're talking about energy production, inflammation, cardiovascular health, cognitive function, healthy aging, and potentially even how we express certain genetic risks over time. One of the reasons metabolic health is so important is that the brain is incredibly energy demanding. And although it represents only a small percentage of total body weight, it consumes a disproportionate amount of energy. Your brain is working constantly. Every thought, every decision, every memory, every movement requires energy, which means the systems involved in producing and regulating that energy matter a lot. This is one reason I pay close attention to markers such as fasting glucose, HbA1c, insulin, triglycerides, HDL cholesterol, waist circumference, body composition, and overall metabolic function. Because longevity isn't simply about avoiding disease, it's about creating an environment where the body can function optimally for as long as possible. And increasingly, metabolic health appears to be one of the major drivers of that outcome. Now here's the exciting part. Unlike your genetics, metabolic health is highly modifiable. Nutrition matters, exercise matters, sleep matters, stress management matters, body composition matters, which means this is an area where many people can make meaningful improvements. And that's empowering, because while we can't change the genes we're inherited, we can absolutely influence the environment those genes operate within. This brings me to a really important point. When somebody comes to see me for a genetic test, I'm never looking at APOE in isolation. In fact, I rarely look at any gene in isolation, because genes exist within a much larger picture. Imagine trying to understand a person's financial situation by looking at a single bank transaction. It wouldn't tell you very much. You need context. The same is true for genetics. If somebody has concerns about healthy aging, longevity, cognitive performance, or family history, I'm looking at multiple layers. Their genetics, their blood work, their lifestyle, their sleep, their nutrition, their training, their stress levels, their medications, their health history, their family history. Because the goal isn't to identify a bad gene, the goal is to identify opportunities. Opportunities to improve health, opportunities to reduce risk, opportunities to support resilience. And this is one of the biggest misconceptions people have about genetic testing, because people assume it's about finding out what's wrong with them. I don't view it that way. I view it as gathering information, and the more information we have, the more personalized our strategy can become. That's where genetics becomes valuable, not because it predicts your future, but because it helps inform decisions. And for people interested in longevity, that's incredibly powerful, because longevity is ultimately a game of making slightly better decisions consistently over periods of time. So where does genetic testing actually fit into all of this? I think of genetic testing as providing another layer of information. Not the only layer, not the most important layer, but another valuable layer. For example, genetic testing may help identify areas related to inflammation, detoxification pathways, nutrient requirements, methylation, caffeine metabolism, exercise response, recovery, and healthy aging. It's not about creating fear. It's about creating awareness. And awareness allows for more personalized recommendations. This is one reason I use genetic testing in clinical practice. Not because I believe genes determine destiny, but quite the opposite. Because I believe understanding genetics can help people make better lifestyle decisions. And when those decisions are repeated over years and decades, they can have a meaningful impact. That's particularly relevant in longevity, because by the time symptoms appear, many of the underlying processes have already been occurring for years. The earlier we identify opportunities, the more time we have to act. And time is one of the greatest advantages in preventative health. So let's bring this all together. If you remember one thing from today's video, remember this. APOE gene is not a prediction of your future. It's information. That's it. And information can be useful because it helps us make informed decisions. What I don't want people taking away from this conversation is fear. I don't want someone discovering they carry APOE4 and believing their future is already been written. That's not what the science says. What I do want people to take away is this. Your brain health is worth investing in, long before symptoms appear, because healthy aging doesn't start at 70. It starts now. It starts with how you sleep, how you eat, how you move, how you recover, and how you manage stress, how you support your metabolic health, and how consistently you repeat those behaviors over time. Longevity isn't built through a single intervention. It's built through thousands of small decisions. And that's actually good news, because it means there is far more within your control than most people realize. And the goal isn't perfection, the goal is progress. The goal is creating an environment that supports health, resilience, and function for as long as possible. And that's ultimately why I find genetics so fascinating. Not because it tells us who we are, but because it helps us make better decisions about who we can become. I'm Sarah from Biohacking Naturopath. I help active Australians optimize performance, recovery, and longevity through personalized health assessments, blood work interpretation, functional testing, and genetic testing. If you'd like to learn more about genetic testing, longevity-focused healthcare, or my genetic predisposition package, you can find the links below. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe because I've got more coming on performance, longevity, and healthy aging. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.